New videos every day.
You can't go and sit in a circle and talk to people and admit that you're an arthritic and then the arthritis goes away. So it's self-contradictory. If alcoholism actually was a disease, literally, then AA wouldn't have any effect. There'd be no point in it.
Thank you for tuning in to Alternative Health. I'm your host, Karina Rachel, and I'm joined today by Dr. Colin Ross. Today we are discussing the question, is alcoholism a disease? Please chime in with your thoughts below. I look forward to seeing your feedback. So Dr. Ross, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me.
So in the previous video, we were discussing substance abuse in general, and we did talk a bit about strategies for handling alcoholism in that video. But in this video, I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Is alcoholism a disease?
Well, that's a very good question and an important question. And there isn't just one simple, okay, here's the answer. So one thing is clearly true. If you've been drinking very, very heavily, and your brain is affected, your balance mechanism is all shot, your liver enzymes are up, you have a physical disease of your body caused by the alcohol. Mm-hmm. So there's no doubt that if you drink enough alcohol, it can cause a disease. Mm-hmm. But that's not the question here. The question is there a disease that causes you to become an alcoholic? That's the question. And the reason it's important is there's a lot of misinformation floating around in our culture. Mm-hmm. And you hear many times, including at AA meetings, it's a disease. You have to get serious about your disease. The disease is winning the battle. The disease is losing the battle. You hear this kind of talk all the time. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that since it's a disease, it's probably genetic, it's probably inherited, it's kind of not your fault. But what does that lead to? It doesn't lead to any solution. So the disease model is funny, just in the AA context, and I refer people to AA all the time. I'm an AA fan. But there's kind of a paradox and contradiction, which is, okay, this is a disease. It's not your fault that you're an alcoholic, so therefore you're going to go to AA so you can recover from your disease. Okay, well, why don't we have AA for arthritis of the hip, or AA for pneumonia, or AA for cancer? It's because the Alcoholics Anonymous approach can't work for an actual disease. You can't go and sit in a circle and talk to people and admit that you're an arthritic and then the arthritis goes away. So it's self-contradictory. If alcoholism actually was a disease, literally, then AA wouldn't have any effect. There'd be no point in it. So that's sort of an unresolved little paradox that people don't exactly look at in our culture in general. The other issue is that the medical field and psychiatry have jumped on and medicalized it like they do with everything, which gives them ownership of the turf and so on. And there's a whole philosophy and ideology behind that. But let's just look at the basic logic of it for a second. And by the way, the genetic research shows pretty clearly that there really isn't a specific gene for alcoholism. There's not one gene, and there's not even a set of genes that's specific for alcoholism. That's not just my opinion. If you go to the DSM-5, which came out in May 2013, it says in the section on alcoholism that there's hundreds of genes for alcoholism, and each of those genes only at most contributes 1 or 2% to the problem.
Oh, wow.
And it also says that the same set of hundreds of genes are the genes that confer risk for schizophrenia, bipolar, autism. So there's not, according to mainstream psychiatry, the American Psychiatric Association, it's not just 1 or 2 genes, it's hundreds in all these different kinds of combinations. Right. Each gene contributes a little tiny bit, and it's the same combinations of genes for all kinds of mental health problems.
So there's not one specific gene for alcoholism.
Or even set of genes. So, but let's say there's 200 genes, and you can have these 5 or these 10 or those 12 or this different combinations. and that's some way contributing to the picture. Well, let's compare this to an actual genetic disease like, say, cystic fibrosis, which is a single gene. But even if it was many genes, there are diseases that definitely are genetic. And if you got the genetic abnormality, you got the disease, you can go to AA forever, you're never going to get rid of the abnormal genetic disease.
Right.
So that's a medical fact. And so therefore it's possible that alcoholism could be like that. But let's say you have the gene for cystic fibrosis and you live in a culture that has no alcohol. Well, it's irrelevant because cystic fibrosis doesn't have anything to do with alcohol, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have the gene and you're going to have the disease whether there is or isn't alcohol in your culture or on the planet. But that's not true for alcoholism. Let's say nobody had discovered alcohol. Or let's say we went back 20,000 years into the past before anybody stumbled on fermentation and alcohol. There were no alcoholics. Mm-hmm. Because there has to be alcohol in the environment for the genes to be relevant. Mm-hmm. So it's not this kind of genetic disease that just relentlessly runs itself from the inside out, because it completely depends on the presence of alcohol in the environment. So in genetic lingo, that's called a promoter. So there has to be a promoter in the environment. Mm. So that's just like lung cancer, for instance. Doctors don't really talk about the gene for lung cancer very much. They talk about the genes for breast cancer, right? Which I'll get to in a second. But lung cancer, let's say that nobody ever got lung cancer if they didn't smoke tobacco heavily for years. And let's say the doctors looked and looked and looked, and they found like these hundreds of genes that contribute to lung cancer, but also contribute to arthritis and also contribute to different things. Well, so what? Mm-hmm. If you don't smoke, you're not going to get it, right? It's the same thing with alcohol. You can't possibly have alcoholism if you don't drink.
Right.
So then we come back to, well, these genes are forcing me to drink. There's nothing I can do about it. Well, if that's true, then we go back to, what's the good of AA then? Mm-hmm. So the only reason that any recovery model for any addiction, including alcohol, can work is if, sure, there's your genes, sure, there's your environment, but there's also your thinking and your choices. If it's not possible to make a choice and decide to stop drinking, then there's no hope for recovery because there's no medication that's going to cure it. Mm-hmm. But we know that recovery is actually possible. And that proves that it's not just this genetic disease that's running the show and making you do it. Right. And then we go to lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of research, which is just obvious common sense, is if you grow up in a culture or a subculture that's very, very alcohol-oriented, with lots and lots of alcoholics, your odds of becoming an alcoholic go up. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you leave that culture and you immigrate to another culture that has very low rates of alcoholism, your risk goes way down. Mm. Which can't be true if it's your genes.
Right.
If you move from China to Sweden, you don't become Swedish. You're still physically Chinese, right? Mm-hmm. You may learn to speak English because that comes from the environment.
Right.
So if you're born in a very low alcohol consumption culture with no alcoholics in your family for the last 10 generations, and you move to some heavy drinking part of the world, your odds of starting to drink are going to go way, way up.
Right.
Proving that it's really the environment that's affecting all of this. Mm. So there's a bunch of logical reasons and a bunch of common sense reasons not to buy this idea that alcohol is a disease. Mm. And really, it's just a model of hopelessness. Right. If it was in fact true that alcoholism is just a genetic disease, then you're just doomed. Mm. Just like you're doomed to have Huntington's chorea or any other genetic disease. So, first of all, it's not logically possible. In the absence of alcohol, it doesn't matter what genes you got. You cannot be an alcoholic. Mm-hmm. It's not scientifically true that the genetic research proves there's any kind of specific genes at all. And why would you want to buy that model? It just leads to hopelessness anyway. Mm-hmm. So it's not true, and it's not useful. So therefore, I don't buy the disease model for alcoholism. But just to clarify one more time, once you're on the path of alcoholism and you've been drinking heavily for many years, you definitely can have diseased brain and diseased liver. There's no question about that.
Right.
But it's a chicken and egg thing. We're talking about what caused the drinking to get started.
In the first place. And that kind of reminds me of, what we were talking about in really many of the previous videos, both on cognitive therapy and substance abuse, this idea that there's kind of an underlying cause or trauma that initially starts the person with the coping behavior of the substance or self-mutilation or eating disorder, whatever it is. And it sounds like that's kind of the same way with alcoholism. There's actually some kind of underlying trauma or emotional upset, either as a result of something in the environment or something in our past, that's actually the cause of the alcoholism, of the reaching out for that coping mechanism.
Right, exactly. And it's usually not one thing, it's a network of different things. But the underlying cause, so-called, is not an underlying biological destiny that's locked in.
Right.
That's just not the case. It's not scientifically true.
Right. And I think you made a really important point that inside the paradigm of the disease model, there is this implied hopelessness where, if you have this disease that's genetic, well, there's really nothing that you can do in your lifetime to change your genetics or to change that disease. So it really takes the hope away from us to subscribe to this disease model paradigm. So if we accept that it's not a physical problem with our body that's causing us to do this, then we actually gain a lot of power and a lot of control to actually do something about it.
Because what happens when you have an actual chronic physical disease? Well, you can cope with it, manage it, take different medications, have a better life rather than a worse life, but you can't recover from it. Mm-hmm. Recovery is impossible from an actual chronic genetic physical disease.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I really had never thought about it like that before. But I think you're right. And I think that within this kind of perspective that you've presented, there actually is a lot more hope for recovery and for healing than in the previous model.
Exactly. So I think it's a more realistic and accurate way to look at it and way more hopeful.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. Are there any other resources or references that you'd like to direct people to? I know you talked about AA as a great resource.
In terms of what's available in our culture for free, AA is obviously the number one place to go. And then whatever support you can get from friends, family, community, church, the more the better.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a very enlightening discussion.
Well, thank you.
I want to thank you so much for watching. I do look forward to seeing your feedback and your response in the comments below. I hope you will subscribe to the Psyche Truth channel so you can come back and join me again for our future videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again next time.